Welcome to class, everyone. Go ahead and grab a seat. Today, we're diving into a genuinely wild era of history. You see, the desperate need to win the bloodiest war in American history turned the battlefield into this chaotic and honestly often failed laboratory of technological experimentation. We are going to be analyzing the downright bizarre weaponry of the American Civil War, because as you'll see, when survival is on the line, people will try literally anything, no matter how unhinged or untested the hypothesis might be. Okay, let's dive right into today's syllabus for this explainer. We'll start with 1. Innovation driven by desperation. Then 2. Reinventing the firearm. 3. Tactical miscalculations in desperation. 4. The dawn of mechanized warfare. 5. Naval sabotage and early submersibles. And finally, 6. Final grades in innovation. All right, starting us off with Section 1. Innovation driven by desperation. Now, here is the defining thesis of today's lecture. The scientific method? Yeah, it was essentially thrown right out the window. Both inventors and generals were just so desperate for a silver bullet to end the conflict that they completely bypassed rigorous testing. They took these totally bizarre scientific hypotheses and pushed them straight into live field tests. And as we're about to explore, the consequences were equal parts hilarious and deeply, deeply tragic. That brings us to Section 2 of our seminar, Reinventing the Firearm. Let's start with our first case study, which perfectly illustrates what happens when you try to over-engineer the basics. Enter the double-barreled cannon, invented in 1862 by a Georgia dentist named John Gillen. The hypothesis here was beautiful in its absolute insanity. You mount 2 barrels side by side, load them with 2 cannonballs connected by a heavy chain, and fire them in unison. The chain stretches out tight and just mows down enemy ranks like a terrifying lawnmower. But the reality? Well, it was disastrous. The 2 barrels simply didn't fire at the exact same millisecond. So instead of flying straight, the cannonballs whipped around each other like a giant uncontrollable bola. During its test fire, it knocked down a bunch of trees, completely demolished a local chimney, and actually ended up killing a cow in a nearby field. Generals quickly declared the whole thing entirely useless and, nope, it never saw a day of battle. That terrifying reality brings us to our next bizarre contraption, the Porter Turret Rifle. Now, this rifle used a wheel-shaped magazine, kind of like a tiny pizza, bolted horizontally right onto the side of the gun. As you fired, the wheel rotated, but because of this circular design, while one chamber pointed forward at the target, another chamber was pointing directly backward, right at the shooter's face. And this introduces a concept called chain fire. That's a fatal malfunction where one spark accidentally ignites all the powder in the entire wheel at once. If that happened, the gun wouldn't just shoot forward, it would shoot a bullet straight backward into the shooter. Astonishingly, a few of these actually saw action, and unsurprisingly, yes, a few men accidentally blew themselves up with their own rifles. Next up, we have the Jar Harmonica Pistol. It promised this massive leap forward in multi-shot firepower, but the mechanism to actually operate the thing was unbelievably clunky. You pull the trigger, sure, but then you have to manually slide this long, flat, horizontal magazine sideways by one slot before you can fire again. Fire, slide, fire, slide. Not only did this slide mechanism jam constantly, but the magazine itself stuck out from the side of the pistol like this weird metal mustache. You couldn't even put it in a normal holster. Honestly, by the time you manually slid your magazine over to the next round, an enemy with a standard Colt revolver had already fired 6 times. Let's shift gears to Section 3, Tactical Miscalculations and Desperation. Now we're looking at weapons born out of sheer logistical panic. Take the Union's Ketchum grenade. On paper, it looked incredibly modern. It was shaped almost like a Nerf football with stabilizing fins at the back and a plunger on the nose to detonate on impact. The idea was to chuck it high up into the air and drop it down into enemy trenches. But here's the catch. Throwing a fin-stabilized dart perfectly nose down while under extreme combat stress is incredibly difficult. If it didn't land perfectly on its nose, it was just a harmless dud. This actually culminated in absolute farce during the siege of Port Hudson. Union soldiers were lobbing these down at Confederate positions, and when the Confederates realized the duds weren't exploding, they improvised. They actually stretched out blankets, caught the incoming grenades like firefighters catching a jumper, and literally threw them right back at the Union lines in this deadly game of hot potato. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point, which Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard brilliantly summed up when he called the Union's Greek fire a mere humbug. A Philadelphia inventor named Levi Short claimed he had successfully reverse-engineered the legendary unquenchable fire used by the Byzantine Empire back in the 7th century. During the Siege of Charleston, the Union loaded this supposed superweapon into 8-inch shells and fired them from a massive cannon they nicknamed the Swamp Angel. The big result? Well, it started a fire in exactly one house, a fire which was promptly put out by the residents using a single bucket of water. So yeah, as Beauregard noted, it was basically just a massive marketing gimmick. Now, while the Union was looking back to the Byzantine Empire, the Confederacy was looking to the Middle Ages. 10,000. I want you to let that number sink in. That is the astonishing number of spring-loaded pikes ordered by Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown in 1862. Why? Because the South was running dangerously low on actual rifles. The governor's brilliant plan was to hand his troops actual wooden pikes tipped with steel blades and just tell them to charge at enemies who were armed with rifled muskets. The common soldier, however, lived in gritty reality, which was vastly disconnected from the political leadership in the capital. They took one look at these things, realized they were being asked to bring literal sticks to a gunfight, and immediately threw them right in the dirt. Let's turn our textbooks to Section 4, The Dawn of Mechanized Warfare. We are now looking at early, somewhat terrifying attempts to bring the automation of the Industrial Revolution straight onto the battlefield. 120. That is the insane number of rounds per minute capable of being fired by the Agar gun. This was basically a proto-machine gun. It featured a hopper on top that fed 58 caliber rounds down into a single barrel, and the whole shebang was operated by a hand crank. Soldiers actually nicknamed it the coffee mill gun because cranking it looked exactly like grinding morning coffee beans. Interestingly enough, President Abraham Lincoln actually watched a demonstration of the Agar gun at the Washington Navy Yard and absolutely loved it. He personally pushed the Army to buy them, but the reality of field use, it was bleak. The barrel overheated constantly, the rounds jammed all the time, and it chewed through precious ammunition at a terrifying rate. The end result was that soldiers flat out refused to take them into battle because they fundamentally didn't work when it mattered most. Now here is where things get truly sci-fi. Two Ohio inventors built the Winnin steam gun. I want you to picture a massive armor-plated wagon with a house-sized boiler belching black smoke. It used absolutely zero gunpowder. Instead, it relied entirely on centrifugal force. It used steam power to spin a metal disc at insane RPMs and fed lead balls onto it to physically fling them out of the barrel. The inventors tried to sell it to the Confederacy, but Union troops intercepted the train in Baltimore. When the Union tested it, they found out it needed a 30-minute warm-up just to build enough steam pressure. By the time it was actually ready to fire, the battle would have completely moved on. It was highly inaccurate, couldn't shoot far, and was eventually just scrapped for parts. Let's move out of the trenches and onto the water for Section 5, Naval Sabotage and Early Submersibles. This is where we step into the realm of espionage. Confederate Captain Thomas Edgeworth Courtney invented what historians wildly consider to be an early IED, the coal torpedo. The construction was deviously simple. You pack a hollow cast-iron shell with gunpowder, seal it shut with beeswax, and then dip the whole thing in tar so it looks exactly like a normal lump of coal. Confederate operatives would smuggle these onto Union ship coal piles. Days later, some poor Union sailor would shovel it into the steam boiler, causing a massive, catastrophic explosion. In fact, it actually destroyed the Union steamer Greyhound. The dark genius of this weapon was that boiler explosions were already incredibly common in the 1860s due to bad maintenance, so the sabotage was almost entirely untraceable. But perhaps the most famously dangerous naval innovations of the era were the submarines. Look at the Confederate H.L. Hunley. It was essentially a 40-foot iron tube powered by 8 guys literally hand-cranking a propeller in the dark. Its weapon? A spar torpedo, which was 135 pounds of gunpowder strapped to a 16-foot stick. In 1864, it actually worked, sinking the USS Housatonic. But tragically, the Hunley sank right after, killing its entire crew. The Union responded with the USS Alligator, which was incredibly ahead of its time. It featured air filtration and even a diver lockout chamber. Sadly, it sank in a storm before ever firing a single shot. Riding a metal tube of explosives underwater proved to be a tragically fatal enterprise for these early pioneers. And finally, we arrive at Section 6, Final Grades in Innovation. So, it is time to hand out the final grades for today's seminar. The double-barrel cannon, that gets a solid F for killing a cow instead of the enemy. The Porter turret rifle gets a D- for, well, shooting its own operators in the face. The coal torpedo, however, earns an A for its devious, undeniable effectiveness as an untraceable sabotage tool. And the submarines? We have to give them an incomplete, but we heavily acknowledge their visionary engineering. So, the crucial point is this. While many of these specific weapons failed the immediate test of combat, their core concepts, mechanized rapid fire, submerged naval attacks, explosive sabotage, they acted as the brutal prototypes for the modern industrialized warfare we see today. Which leaves us with this final thought for today's class. The American Civil War is already the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. But when you look at the terrifying scope of what they tried to invent, imagine how much bloodier it could have been if these deadly hypotheses had actually worked flawlessly. I'll let you ponder that one. Class dismissed, and thank you for joining today's explainer.